France, 1940. The spring air was still and quiet along the eastern border, where concrete giants stretched for hundreds of miles, the Maginot Line. Bunkers, fortresses, gun turrets, and underground rail lines formed what the French government called an impenetrable wall. It was their shield, their pride, and their illusion of safety. French soldiers stationed there joked that not even God could break through it. Inside these massive steel and concrete fortresses, men played cards, smoked cigarettes, and waited, confident that if Germany ever dared to invade again, it would end here, in the trenches of Alsace and Lorraine. On the other side of the border, however, the German High Command was thinking differently. Hitler and his generals had studied the Maginot Line carefully. They knew it was strong, too strong to assault head-on. But they also knew something else. No fortress covers everything. The French had left one region lightly defended, the Ardennes Forest, a stretch of dense trees, steep hills, and narrow roads that military planners had dismissed as impassable for tanks. To the French staff, it was a natural barrier. To the Germans, it was an open door. On May 10, 1940, before dawn, that door opened. Over 1,500 German tanks, supported by dive bombers and mechanized infantry, rumbled through the fog-filled valleys of Luxembourg and Belgium. Civilians awoke to the distant growl of engines that sounded like thunder rolling through the forest. French commanders thought it was a feint, a distraction from the real attack they expected to come through northern Belgium, the same route Germany had used in 1914. But they were wrong. The main German spearhead, Panzer Group Kleist, led by Generals Guderian and Rommel, wasn't heading north. It was slicing straight through the Ardennes toward the French rear, toward the heart of their defenses. As the French sat confidently behind the Maginot Line, listening to radio reports of battles far to the north, the real danger was already moving behind them. Within 48 hours, German tanks were across the Meuse River. Within a week, they were racing toward the English Channel. What France believed to be its strongest wall became meaningless in the face of speed, deception, and coordination. The Maginot Line's guns never even fired at the main German force. The French had fortified yesterday's war and were being crushed by tomorrow's. The stage was set for one of the most shocking military collapses in modern history. The German Blitzkrieg had just begun, and France had no idea it was already over. When the German offensive began on May 10, 1940, it didn't look like a masterstroke. It looked like madness. The Ardennes was a nightmare for vehicles. Narrow, twisting roads that could barely handle horse carts, let alone hundreds of tanks, artillery, and supply trucks. Even German officers doubted the plan. If the column jammed or broke down, the entire army would be trapped in a bottleneck, easy prey for Allied bombers. But Hitler and his generals, particularly Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian, believed in a different kind of warfare, one built on speed, coordination, and shock. This was Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a doctrine that abandoned the old, grinding trench warfare of World War I. Instead of slow-moving infantry assaults, it relied on tanks, aircraft, and radios to strike with precision and momentum. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy in battle. It was to paralyze them before they even understood what was happening. As the tanks pushed through the Ardennes, French reconnaissance planes spotted the movement, but were ignored by command. High-ranking officers in Paris dismissed the reports as impossible. No large force could pass through there, they said. It must be a diversion. But it wasn't. It was the main thrust of the German invasion, Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow. The first major obstacle was the Meuse River near Sedan. The French believed the steep riverbanks and fortified bunkers would hold any attacker for at least 2 weeks. The Germans did it in 2 days. Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, dropping precision strikes on French artillery and communication lines. The noise and chaos shattered morale. Soldiers abandoned positions before the first German troops even arrived. Then, under a haze of smoke and fire, German engineers built pontoon bridges while tanks crossed under constant enemy fire. By the time French reinforcements arrived, Guderian's panzers were already across. The speed and coordination were unlike anything the Allies had seen before. Entire divisions that had trained to hold fixed lines were suddenly surrounded without even realizing it. Meanwhile, the main Allied armies, including the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and France's best troops, were far to the north, locked in heavy combat with what they thought was the main German attack. But that force in Belgium, led by General von Bock, was just a decoy. The real danger was behind them. Once the German armor crossed the Meuse, it raced west, cutting behind the Allied lines. Town after town fell in hours, not days. French command couldn't react fast enough. Their communications relied on telephones and couriers, while the Germans coordinated instantaneously through radio. In less than a week, German tanks had done what the French thought impossible. They had bypassed the Maginot Line entirely, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers in northern France and Belgium. This was no longer just an invasion. It was a collapse in real time. French generals ordered counterattacks that never connected. Divisions moved too slowly, supply lines were shattered, and confusion reigned at every level. The Germans were fighting a war of movement. The French were still fighting a war of position. By May 20th, German armor reached the English Channel, effectively cutting off the BEF and French First Army from the rest of France. The Maginot Line, still intact and fully manned, now sat uselessly hundreds of kilometers away from the front. A monument to outdated thinking. The Ardennes gamble had paid off beyond imagination. In just 10 days, the German army had done what the Kaiser's forces couldn't do in 4 years of World War I. France's mighty fortifications, its years of planning, and its faith in static defense had been outmaneuvered by innovation and speed. The Allies called it a disaster. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg. By late May 1940, Europe was watching the impossible unfold. The German Wehrmacht, barely 2 decades removed from its defeat in World War I, was now tearing through one of the most powerful nations on Earth. The French army, once considered the strongest in Europe, was collapsing at a speed that stunned even the Germans themselves. As Guderian's panzers reached the English Channel, a massive Allied force, over 300,000 British, French, and Belgian troops, was trapped in a pocket near the northern coast. It was a catastrophe born not from inferior numbers or bravery, but from a total breakdown in strategy. The Maginot Line, the pride of French defense, now stood useless, intact but irrelevant, as German troops had simply gone around it through the Ardennes. The speed of the German advance fractured communication between Allied commands. French headquarters in Paris received outdated reports hours too late, while German armored units operated with fluid coordination. Each panzer division acted like an independent spearhead, maintaining momentum without waiting for orders from above. This was Blitzkrieg in motion: initiative, communication, and relentless pressure. As the Allied forces were cut off, the Germans turned toward the coast. The British Expeditionary Force, under Lord Gort, fell back toward the small port of Dunkirk. Hitler, unexpectedly, halted his tanks for a brief period, partly on advice from Göring, who insisted the Luftwaffe could finish off the trapped armies from the air. It was a costly decision, In those few days, the British organized Operation Dynamo, a desperate evacuation using every ship, boat, and fishing vessel available. Between May 26th and June 4th, over 338,000 soldiers were rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk under constant Luftwaffe attack. But while the evacuation saved Britain's army, it left behind nearly all their heavy equipment: tanks, trucks, artillery, and supplies. France now faced the full fury of the German advance alone. South of Dunkirk, the French government struggled to hold the line. Entire divisions were exhausted or encircled. Cities like Lille and Calais fought to the last man, buying precious time for the evacuation, but the outcome was already sealed. The German momentum was unstoppable. By June 5th, Hitler unleashed Fall Rot, Case Red, the second phase of the campaign aimed at conquering the rest of France. The Germans crossed the Somme and the Aisne rivers under cover of Stuka dive bombers, smashing French defenses and scattering what remained of organized resistance. Paris, once thought to be impregnable, was declared an open city on June 13th to prevent its destruction. Just 2 days later, German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The world watched in disbelief as the capital of Western Europe fell to Nazi Germany in only 6 weeks. On June 22, 1940, France officially surrendered. The signing took place in the very same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had been forced to surrender at the end of World War I, a symbolic act of revenge orchestrated by Hitler himself. The fall of France wasn't just a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake that shook the entire world. The Maginot Line, once hailed as the symbol of security, became the ultimate monument to military arrogance. Years of planning, engineering, and faith in fortification had been undone by a single idea: mobility. For Germany, it was the greatest victory in its history. In just 6 weeks, they had defeated a nation that had bled them dry for 4 years in the previous war. For the Allies, it was a devastating lesson. Britain now stood alone against a victorious Germany that dominated the continent. Yet even in victory, there were hints of overconfidence. Some German officers believed France had been too easy, that Blitzkrieg was unstoppable. But as history would later show, the same lightning that illuminated Europe in 1940 would burn out in the endless snows of the Eastern Front. The Maginot Line had fallen without being attacked. France had been defeated not by brute force, but by a revolution in warfare, one that the world would never forget. The fall of France in 1940 sent shockwaves around the world. In just 46 days, the German Wehrmacht had done what no army in modern history had ever achieved. They dismantled an entire nation's defenses, bypassed its strongest fortifications, and forced a world power to its knees. The stunning success convinced many, both inside and outside Germany, that the Wehrmacht was unbeatable, that Blitzkrieg was a perfect science. But behind the triumph lay critical flaws and dangerous illusions that would later haunt the Third Reich. For the Germans, the campaign validated everything they had theorized after World War I. The defeat of France proved that mobility and coordination could destroy any static defense. German strategists pointed to the combination of tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support as the foundation of modern warfare. But in truth, the campaign had been as much about risk as it was about brilliance. The Ardennes breakthrough had been a gamble, a narrow corridor where a single Allied bombing raid could have trapped the entire German armored column. Their success depended on speed, confusion, and luck, not invincibility. Inside France, the humiliation cut deep. The Maginot Line had not failed because it was weak. It failed because it was irrelevant. Designed for a repeat of the Great War, it never accounted for a new kind of war where front lines dissolved overnight. The defeat shattered the French psyche. Within weeks, France was divided. The northern half under direct German occupation, and the southern free zone controlled by Marshal Philippe Pétain's collaborationist Vichy regime. The republic that had once stood for liberty was now under foreign control. In Britain, the lessons of France's collapse were studied relentlessly. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, only newly in office, understood that the war was far from over. Blitzkrieg was terrifyingly effective, but it also revealed Germany's weaknesses. The Wehrmacht was not fully mechanized. Much of its logistics still relied on horse-drawn transport. Fuel, spare parts, and supplies were stretched thin. If the Allies could endure the storm, time and production would turn the tide. For the United States, still officially neutral, the fall of France was a wake-up call. American military observers saw how unprepared the Allies had been for modern warfare. In response, the U.S. accelerated production of tanks, aircraft, and radio systems and began rethinking its own doctrine to mirror the speed and coordination of the Germans. The lessons of 1940 would shape American strategy from North Africa to Normandy. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler stood at the height of his power. The French surrender had made him a legend across Germany. To the public, it seemed as though the Führer had achieved the impossible, defeating two great powers in under a year. But among his generals, a more dangerous belief began to take hold: that the Wehrmacht could not fail. The myth of German invincibility was born, a myth that would lead Hitler to overreach in the years ahead. The success of Blitzkrieg also created a new kind of arrogance within the German high command. Instead of questioning their logistical limits or resource constraints, they grew confident that any nation could be broken with speed and shock. In their eyes, France had been the ultimate test, and they had passed it flawlessly. Yet, as historians now know, the French campaign masked deep cracks in the German war machine. The Luftwaffe had suffered heavy losses, supply chains were stretched to their breaking point, and armored divisions were worn down after just a few weeks of combat. Still, the victory emboldened Hitler to set his sights further east, toward the Soviet Union. He believed that the same lightning war that crushed France could topple an even larger empire. He was wrong. The vastness of the Soviet Union, the brutal winters, and the sheer scale of the Eastern Front would expose every weakness hidden beneath the triumph of 1940. For the Allies, the lessons were sobering but clear. Fortresses and static defenses belonged to the past. The future belonged to mobility, communication, and adaptability. Every major Allied campaign from 1942 onward, from El Alamein to D-Day, was built on the principle of outmaneuvering the enemy, not just overpowering them. The Maginot Line became a symbol of misplaced confidence, a relic of an old world destroyed by innovation. And for Germany, the lightning war that had begun in the forests of the Ardennes would eventually burn out, consumed by its own speed and overconfidence. When the dust of 1940 finally settled, Europe had changed forever. The fall of France was not just a military collapse, it was a complete redefinition of how wars would be fought. The world watched in disbelief as the seemingly impossible became reality, and every nation, from Washington to Moscow, began rewriting its doctrine in response to what Germany had accomplished through Blitzkrieg. The victory over France taught two conflicting lessons. To the Allies, it was a brutal reminder that no line, no fortification, no wall of steel or concrete could hold back a force that moved faster than command structures could react. But to Germany, it taught the wrong lesson: that speed alone could overcome any obstacle, that morale and surprise could replace logistics and endurance. That overconfidence would later drive the Third Reich into catastrophe. In the years immediately following the campaign, military thinkers across the world dissected Blitzkrieg. They saw how it fused three critical elements: armor, air power, and communication. The panzers were not used as blunt instruments, but as precision tools. The Luftwaffe did not bomb blindly, but targeted enemy communications and morale. And, most importantly, every German unit, from tank crew to field commander, used radios to react in real time. This synergy turned an army into a single living machine. The French, by contrast, had built their doctrine around deliberation, control, and defense. Their generals believed battles should unfold at predictable tempos, managed from far behind the front lines. That thinking had worked in 1918, but by 1940, it was outdated. The Germans didn't wait for plans to be approved. They acted, adjusted, and adapted faster than their enemies could think. Blitzkrieg wasn't a miracle. It was a system built on timing, communication, and trust in decentralized decision-making, but it required constant motion. Once the momentum stopped, Blitzkrieg lost its power. And in that truth lay the seeds of Germany's undoing. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, he believed he could repeat the magic of France. He saw another Ardennes in the endless plains of Eastern Europe, another rapid strike that would collapse an enemy before it could respond. But the Soviet Union was not France. Its depth, its weather, and its sheer will to survive turned Germany's lightning war into a slow, grinding nightmare. Tanks froze in the snow, supply lines stretched for thousands of miles, and Blitzkrieg's promise of speed dissolved in the mud and ice of the Eastern Front. The Maginot Line's fall had created an illusion of German perfection. But beneath that illusion, the same flaws remained: limited fuel reserves, overstretched manpower, and dependence on a handful of elite armored divisions. As the war dragged on, those weaknesses became fatal. The same confidence that drove German tanks through the Ardennes now blinded them to the limits of their power. For the Allies, however, the lesson of France became the foundation of their future victories. The British learned to blend mobility with intelligence, leading to successes in North Africa. The Americans absorbed the principles of fast, coordinated warfare, using them to devastating effect from Normandy to the Rhine. Even the Soviets adapted, trading static defense for deep, mobile operations that mirrored Blitzkrieg's core concepts, and then turned them against the Germans. In the end, the Battle of France was more than a campaign. It was a revolution. It marked the death of 19th-century warfare and the birth of the modern battlefield. The defeat of France showed that the strongest walls could crumble if your enemy could think faster, move faster, and strike before you could react. But it also proved something deeper: that innovation without restraint becomes self-destruction. The same tactics that conquered France would later overextend Germany's reach and destroy its armies. Blitzkrieg had rewritten the rules, but it could not escape the laws of reality. When German troops marched through Paris in 1940, they believed they had found the formula for victory. 5 years later, those same streets would echo with the footsteps of American, British, and Free French soldiers, marching the other way. Because in war, speed wins battles, but discipline, endurance, and truth win wars. If you were moved by this story, by the rise, the brilliance, and the ultimate downfall of Germany's Blitzkrieg, then like, share, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends, where we bring you the untold stories that changed the course of history. one battle at a time.